Welcome back to Air Quality Matters. I'm Simon Jones, and coming up, a conversation with José Luis Castro, Director General Special Envoy for Chronic Respiratory Diseases at the WHO. With a career in global health and leadership, with over 3 decades of experience, he has dedicated his career to public health. His leadership has advanced sustainable health initiatives in developing countries and urban centres alike around the world. Today, he leads the WHO's efforts on chronic respiratory diseases, including asthma and COPD. And it was this I wanted to discuss with him. When a child can't breathe, everything else stops. But when an adult has COPD, the world kind of crosses the street. COPD is the hidden respiratory crisis. It is often met with a shrug of the shoulders or silent judgment, and more recently, post-pandemic, fear and sometimes even judgment. We assume it's a consequence of lifestyle choices. We tell ourselves they brought it on themselves somehow, and in doing so, we give ourselves permission to look away. This judgment is a failure of empathy and a failure of society. The truth is far more uncomfortable. While smoking is a factor, the blueprint for COPD is often drawn decades earlier in places where people live and work. We discussed chronic respiratory disease's heavy toll on society and the individual, its causes, and how the WHO is going after this invisible crisis. We talked more broadly about global initiatives in air quality and how organisations like the WHO take big ideas and implement them across the diversity of human situations and environments. A fascinating window into how initiatives like the Global Pledge for Indoor Air Quality, for example, can learn from this experience. This is a wake-up call of a conversation, full of insight and experience. This genuinely is not one to miss. Please don't forget to check out the sponsors in the show notes and at airqualitymatters.net. This is a conversation with José Luis Castro. Before we get into the kind of the meat of the questions, I think it'd be really interesting for listeners who don't know you, José, is what your role is in the WHO, because it's quite specific, I think, to the conversation we're going to have today. So perhaps let's just start there and maybe explain a little bit about what you do.
Sure, Simon. I am the Director General's Special Envoy for Chronic Respiratory Diseases. This is a position that was created in 2024 in recognition of the high burden and the importance that chronic respiratory diseases have in the world, and WHO's commitment to elevate this into the agenda, to give visibility, to raise awareness, and also to bring political commitment to addressing this issue globally.
So does that mean you're basically leading the WHO's response to chronic respiratory diseases, and you will then travel and raise awareness and speak to organisations around the globe about how this is being dealt with from country to country? Is that kind of a fair assessment of what it is?
It's close. As you know, WHO has a technical team, and within the Department of Non-Communicable Diseases and Mental Health, and that's where chronic respiratory diseases and the technical unit is based. In my role is more as an ambassadorial role to bring awareness within the health community, but also within the policy, within the media, and the general public at large. There are 3 Director General's Special Envoys at the WHO. I'm one of those 3. There's one for climate health and another one for patient safety.
For people that aren't aware, just I guess so we're aware of why you might need a Director General of a particular disease. Chronic respiratory disease is a significant issue globally, isn't it?
Absolutely. Chronic respiratory diseases. And I want to qualify that to say that at WHO we are focusing on the two largest components of that, which are asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. These two diseases combined affect more than 500 million people in the world and cause close to 3.5 million deaths every year. Yet despite this burden, and when you think about 3.5 million people dying every year, that this will be on the headlines, that this will generate a lot of news or commentaries, they have been largely silent. In fact, when I took this position in 2024, I did a quick search in the New York Times to see if there had been an article done about COPD, and I found one. I found such article, and it was an obituary of the singer Sinead O'Connor, the cause of death for her. And yet, in that year, as you say, more than 3.5 million people had died. So the work that I do is to try to change that, to give visibility to these diseases, to make sure that it is understood in the public at large, outside the scientific journals and scientific conferences, that we bring chronic respiratory diseases to the policymakers' attention, to the mainstream media, and as such that resources are mobilized to address the prevention of these diseases and also the treatment of those 500 million people that are affected by chronic respiratory diseases.
And if anybody listens to the show and knows how we talk about the health impacts of air quality, they'll recognize that the deaths are just the tip of the iceberg. There are years of disability and missing out on family things and impacts on work and life that lead up to that death. So the toll of this must be extraordinary globally.
Absolutely, Simon. When we talk about the people affected, we also need to take into account that they are part of a family, that they're part of a community. So it affects the family members, the caregivers, those people in the places where they work or they go to school. So the 500 million people is just a fragment. We can probably multiply that times 2 or even 3 in terms of the number of people that are affected by these diseases. And especially with COPD, which is a progressive disease, and as the person becomes sicker, they become a prisoner within their own home and require more care and more attention from the family members and also from medical providers.
Yeah, and I know we've discussed this before, that, I mean, obviously there's a clinical difference between asthma and COPD, but there's also a huge perception difference, isn't there, between asthma and COPD? And I guess that feeds in somehow into why we can effectively lose 3 million people off the face of the planet every year, and there's barely one article about it, that it gets lost in the noise somehow. And that's something to do with how the world sees chronic respiratory illnesses, isn't it?
Absolutely. And there is you touched there on an issue that is very important, the stigmatization or the stigma, around these diseases. Well, asthma tends to develop largely during childhood and it's managed, and we don't know the causes exactly what causes the asthma. There has been for years the science and also the understanding that those who developed COPD were largely because they were smokers, so it was something they brought upon themselves. Now, with air pollution, the science is showing also that a large number of those people, that are developing COPD are developing because of the quality of the air that they breathe. But that stigma, it's out there in the population. And part of the work that I'm trying to do is to break that stigma, to say that these are not only ex-smokers. I mean, anyone who breathes in a sense is at risk of developing COPD. If you live in a city that has a poor air quality, or if you work in a place where the quality of the air is compromised, that's going to have put you at risk of developing this disease. And because of that, this has made these diseases largely invisible. When I refer to these diseases as the Cinderella of of public health, it is true. I mean, they have not been brought into the policy discussions because there hasn't been the advocacy, the push, to address them effectively for a variety of reasons. One, because they're not infectious. Second, because it is believed that these were brought upon by the smokers. And third, because they're also the symptoms are so masked. Breathlessness usually is not very visible and not seen as a threat to others around them.
Yeah, we must come on to specifically COPD later. So I've made a note to come back to that because I think it's good for people to really understand what we're talking about and what the impacts of that disease are. I mean, one of the reasons we struck up a conversation in the first instance was because we bumped into each other at the UN General Assembly event on indoor air quality, and one of the things that came out of that event was this pledge and this idea around indoor air quality that and the central theme to that really was air quality as a human right, and it really got me thinking that ideal of everybody should have access to clean air quality, and these big ideals, these global perspectives or pledges are fascinating and equally troubling in the same way, because everybody recognizes that the world is a really complex, messy place, and a grand overarching idea or ideal is, you could argue, is impossible to accomplish, in some ways. But an international organization like yours, the WHO, deals in that kind of language and that reality all the time, that you understand risks. You're trying to set statements that resonate with people, and then you have to deal with the realities of a global planet that has a whole range of economic statuses and development states and political crises and conflict. It's a hard place to start trying to progress. So I was really fascinated. It was one of the principal ideas of getting you on and talking to you, was to talk to an organization where the rubber hits the road, in that sense, that you are in that position where you're taking on something like chronic respiratory diseases, one of the most significant causes of death globally, and then having to deal with the realities of raising awareness of that and communicating that around the world. How do you even begin to start to unpack something like that? Is that something you kind of really have to sit down and have a global overarching strategic plan to say, right, we've got this ideal, how do we implement this? How does that work practically?
It's an excellent question, Simon. And, for years, we have been telling the world about the number of cases and the number of fatalities that these diseases cause. And yet this has not moved the needle. This has not caused the capture the public's imagination in the way that it should, or the way that it moves the scientific community. So I think part of the work that we do at WHO is, how we bring these conversations outside just of a very small, medical circles and scientific circles, and into a broader audience to capture, the imagination of, the public at large, to change the face of these diseases. And one of those, we found that, something that resonates with people is, clean air. Clean air is a powerful idea because breathing is universal. And everyone understands what it means to struggle for breath. So, when we are in a city that's polluted, or when we are in a place that's filled with smoke, we feel that, and people can relate that. So when we speak about clean air, we connect with people immediately. But the exposure to polluted air is, or as we know, is deeply unequal. So, when we speak around the world, I have to be careful. Some cities have better quality of air than others. So where you're born, how you cook, where you work, and how your city is designed, all shape the way that you breathe. So that is why the clean air is both a health issue and a justice issue, as your question alluded to, and what we're trying to bring to the attention of the public. At the WHO, we translate the science into standards. We develop the air quality guidelines, the clinical protocols, the list of essential, medicines. And then we work with the countries to adapt them to the local realities. The realities are very different, as you know, from economies that are more developed and those that are in low and middle income countries. And there is not a single solution, but there is one shared objective that we work. And that objective is that there will be fewer people developing chronic disease because of the avoidable, exposures to polluted air. But I think that, over the past year, if we look at what has gotten traction in our conversations to advance chronic respiratory diseases, the conversations around indoor and outdoor air quality have produced, the most engagement and also brought about more partners to help us in this effort.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that. And I guess there is always globally significant events that create a talking point for that. This Christmas it's been India and New Delhi, and some of the cities in India have been very front and center. Last summer and early spring last year, it was wildfire smoke, in Australia and Canada and North America. So there's always a visible manifestation of poor air quality somewhere in the world, or something that's highlighting it. The challenge is when it isn't that. I was talking to a friend of mine in India there last week, and I was asking her how are things in Delhi now, and she said, "Oh, they're much better. We're back to normal of 300 micrograms per meter cubed." As if that was a good thing. But it's all, it's all perspective and context, obviously. But the risk is when there aren't those events, isn't there? That you're back to the normal high levels of pollution in certain areas that people tolerate and they begin to accept. There's a huge psychological dissonance there with the risk, because your body has to do that, I guess, and your mind has to do that. And that was one of the questions I wanted to ask you. I agree with you. One of the powerful things is that ideating what good looks like. I think everybody can have a sense of what fresh air or good air quality could be or should be. So that's one piece of the jigsaw puzzle. The arguably harder piece is the risk piece of the jigsaw puzzle. What the language is and what are the tools that work for people to recognize, no, 300 isn't a good place to be. It is better than where we were, but it's still a high risk. And that, I think, is still really uncertain. Sometimes fear unlocks a response. Sometimes that doesn't. Sometimes it's a protective mechanism. A lot of, in the psyche, a lot of people want to protect the next generation or the people or the community around them. That can be a powerful tool to unlock people. Do you wrestle with that as well? What are the things, I think we can ideate what good is, but we need to somehow figure out what moves the needle with the risk here? How do I get people in an occupational setting to recognise that this is a potential COPD problem for me later in life if I don't correct this?
You touched there on one point is, as we live in an area, we see it every day. It might be polluted. And, as long as we are breathing, we think everything should be okay, right? But it's not okay. We can see that, for example, we can measure in a city or in a community, the effects of the quality of the air by, asthma exacerbations or admissions to hospitals that are being caused. And these are data points that should flag that there is an issue that needs to be looked at, and especially with the quality of air. In European cities, children living near traffic corridors are exposed to that and suffer, episodes of asthma and higher asthma rates than in other places. In African cities, for example, diesel generators and open burning, raise the daily exposure. But even in parts of Latin America, the seasonal fires and raise the pollution levels. Or in Europe, we have seen, for example, and in North America, forest fires. When we look at the amount of contamination in the air caused from those, that's going to have an effect on large number of people in cities. So more and more we are seeing these episodes that are, some are caused by climate change, others are caused by the daily life in cities and exposures to toxic fumes from cars or factories. And all of them are having an effect on the lungs of people, even those that are not yet born. And I think that is the part that we have to be very sensitive, that, a child who, or someone who is still not yet born is going to come into the world in that environment with their lungs compromised and at risk for developing a chronic respiratory disease in life. So the lung disease, often begins long before the first medical visits. That's why the clean air prevention is not an environmental luxury. And when we were in New York, this is what we were talking about, that, for too long, the environmental health is seen as, something that we do if we can, but it actually has to be an essential part of the public health response and the public health discussions on how to improve the quality of air in our cities.
Yeah, and there's a fundamental fairness tenet to this as well, as you pointed out earlier. There's huge environmental social injustice here that even if you're in a relatively clean city, let's say London, where lots of work has been done on reducing emissions, the risk is not equal. And we know every time we look at this that those who are least able and most vulnerable are the ones that are exposed the most, time and time again. So even if your city is relatively okay, and I use the relative carefully, there will be pockets within that city, and usually in lower economic areas, that are more exposed than you are, and that's a problem. That this is an environmental justice challenge as much as it is a political problem and an engineering problem and a scientific problem, isn't it?
Yes. And to add, I want also to add that there's also tobacco smoking. Tobacco smoking is a big problem, as you know. It causes nearly 7 million deaths every year. And there are still millions of people, exposed to secondhand smoke. The health impact of those are going to be detrimental in the years to come. Now, countries have made tremendous strides in addressing tobacco control, and that gives us hope, because with the same political commitment, the same level of action that was taken to address tobacco. Clean air can also be part of that. It must be part of that agenda as well to be addressed at country level.
We can become a bit siloed in our thinking about smoking, but I was only having a conversation with Max Sherman actually recently, who was doing quite a contentious piece of work around designing ventilation rates that would allow smoking indoors. And, I was asking him, why would you consider creating a standard for indoor smoking? But he said, I agree. Like, I'm completely appalled at the idea of smoking. But the reality is there are some countries in the world where the needle is not moving on smoking, that culturally it's deeply embedded in their society. So if that is going to happen, it's up to us as engineers to try and protect those that aren't smoking. So as bananas as it might sound, having to develop a standard for indoor tobacco smoking
to protect the others.
It seems like a completely backward step. Actually, it's a really good example of how complex the world is, that there are some societies that, if you ignore this idea and just hope that everybody bans smoking indoors, there are going to be generations of people in some countries that are going to be unnecessarily exposed if you don't have a standard for it or an engineering solution for it. So it's a hard road, tobacco, isn't it? I mean, it's one of those things that, I'm from Ireland. I was originally from the UK. We kind of just got used to the fact that people have started to reduce the amount of smoking, and certainly you don't smoke in public places and indoors really anymore. And even in the home, I think the statistics are reducing significantly. But that's not the case everywhere at all, not even close. That must frustrate you enormously. That is such a risk, such an injury to what you're trying to do, and it's still so prevalent everywhere.
It frustrates me, for example, that tobacco, a product that we know kills millions of people every year, continues to be sold. I mean, tobacco should be banned, full stop. But the past 20 years in tobacco control gave me hope. I mean, there's been progress made. Remember the days when, you went on an airplane and the row behind you was the beginning of the smoking row. So it didn't matter whether you were, in row 14 or row 17, you were sharing that contaminated air for the duration of the flight. I used to hate to fly because when I will arrive, my clothes all smell like smoke. And that has changed, and that has changed also in, smoking in restaurants and in many public places. They have been battles that have been, won through the efforts, of activists and also policymakers, but also having the political will to take action and make a commitment to reduce the number of deaths caused by tobacco. Yet there's still a lot of work to be done, as there are countries that still manufacture tobacco, for example, and sell it, and there's still also the danger of the new products that are coming into the market and engaging our young people. So it's a continued work. We cannot lower the guard, but it does give us hope that the policies that packages that were put in place, to address tobacco, we see are having an effect in reducing tobacco use around the world. But I think that with every with every battle that we win in public health, it's not the end of the road. It's still, we know we win one, but there are other challenges that need to be overcome related to that.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, the WHO is not the world police. You can only influence, guide, provide information, and so on. At some point there has to be political will on the ground. There has to be public will to engage. They have to be in a position to do certain things about it. That was one of the things I meant to ask you, really, when we're looking at this kind of spectrum of what drives action at a public awareness level, what seems to be universal from an action perspective is this idea of agency, that someone actually has the agency to change an outcome in their lives, but has to believe they have the agency to do it as well. That's an enormous piece in this. And, that's really difficult in places like Delhi. If you're just a normal person and you're exposed to pollution and you're not in an economic position to move, it must feel quite hopeless at times trying to fight that. And similarly, there are people in jobs exposed to occupational risks in the same breath, and so on. So outside of the people choosing or not to smoke, a lot of this comes down to factors that are often outside of the control of the individual. Collectively, there can be a public will to change, but the action actually has to be, changed at a political level often, doesn't it?
No, absolutely. I think we see the evidence that what works is the implementation of policy packages that involve also the public and the participation of the public in implementing them. I go back again to the tobacco control and the Empower. WHO recommended Empower policy strategy that countries have been adopting for tobacco control. There are 5 components in there, and many of those, require the government's active, participation, whether it's taxation, the banning on advertising, the establishment of, smoke-free zones. So it creates, a framework that allows the government intervention, but also the public understanding of what the end result is. And in air pollution, for example, we have seen that, cities that have established, low emission zones, have reduced the number of, asthma attacks. African cities, for example, that have established monitoring networks, so the first line of protection. Or public transport reform. So it all goes back to that, policy making and the effective implementation of those policies. We know, for years that, that just a voluntary participation doesn't produce the necessary results, and especially in the scale of these problems.
But I think, I don't want to sound too hopeless about this. We've seen time and time and time again, when there is that political will to make a difference, we can fundamentally shift how a regional or a city environment is exposed to these risks. We've seen it in London with the Clean Air Act. We've seen it in the States with their versions of Clean Air Acts and smog and so on over the years. We saw it in China in the early 2000s with the Under the Dome awakening. We probably, or hopefully, will likely see it in India. You get the sense there that there's some momentum building now behind some of the fundamental drivers of that pollution. It doesn't mean you fix everything, but there's some unbelievably low-hanging fruit, and you can make an enormous difference to public health once that will kicks in at a political level.
Absolutely, I think that it is showing the benefits of that policy, the benefits, to reducing disease, to increasing productivity, to reducing the healthcare costs, for example, and also by creating an environment that is healthy. I mean, think about, just 20 years ago, just going to a restaurant and most major cities where there was smoking, you came out of that restaurant smelling like smoke, and you didn't, quite enjoy the meal. Now today, you go to a restaurant and you come out, you enjoy your time there, and you don't come out smelling like cigarettes, and it's a healthier, environment that was created. So those benefits to the public, that is not just always a negative aspect to it, but that there is a positive overall benefit to the individual and to society needs to be highlighted.
Yeah, and we know that and we'll come on to it in a minute, like the impacts of these long-term chronic diseases, they have huge economic impacts. Like sorting this stuff out is not just a one-way street for money. That the return on investment for sorting out, particularly disasters like Delhi or China or the really high level pollution of events, but even the mid to high level background pollution we see in many urban centres, that this stuff has a huge impact to your economy, to absenteeism, to health impacts, to drains. Like, even as you said earlier, this isn't just the person that suffers with the illnesses, it's family members having to care for them, take time off work. This stuff is hugely costly to an economy, isn't it?
To an economy, and also to people, to lives. I think that here you bring the issue, breathing in a way, connects the environment, the health, and the equity in a way. So when we are protecting the air quality, we are protecting the lungs, and when we're diagnosing early, we are reducing the suffering, but we are also ensuring that those people are going to be more productive at work. There's going to be less absenteeism and, effects on the economy. And we're also creating an environment that, allows for longer term, participation, active participation in the economy by people, because they are not going to be sick. So when we align those policies, we strengthen the economies in countries. How people breathe each day is, one of the clearest measures on whether, health policy is working.
And I was kind of mulling this idea over the Christmas break, as we were talking about before, with various writings and scribblings, this idea that it's just this recognition that we're not in the city is in us. And this is the fundamental problem with air quality, and not just from an impact on chronic respiratory diseases, but as we know, these pollutants are transversing the membranes and into our systems and are having impacts on every organ of the body. We are the air we breathe, quite literally, and our lungs are phenomenal tools for being an open access system to our body. Yeah, and that's quite a unique position. I was talking to somebody about this the other day. It's a developmental error in a lot of ways. The purpose of the lungs is to efficiently absorb stuff, because that it has to get oxygen in and CO2 and other stuff out. That's its job. Every other element of our body has pretty sophisticated protection mechanisms for environmental injury, whether it's the skin, the dermis has huge protection levels, the gut has huge protection impacts. But our lungs are just an open source machine for absorbing everything that we're in. And I think what people don't realize is the surface area of the lungs is the size of a badminton court, so every space we're in, every second of the day, that badminton court size area is just sucking up anything that we're in. So just because you can't see pollution in a space or in a room doesn't mean your lungs aren't happily collecting all of that bad stuff, every breath you take. It's quite a frightening mental leap, really, when you think about that, we are literally the environment that we're in. We're made of the air that we breathe. And you can't say that so much about a lot of the other environmental risks that are around us.
No, and for being such a large organ in the human body, the lung doesn't get a lot of public attention or discussions. If you look at the literature, there are always articles about, cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, or diabetes, or, other conditions, but rarely there's, a discussion on the lungs. And air pollution damages the lungs, before birth, the exposure during pregnancy, and early childhood, shapes lung development for life, and it's it's already a child that is coming with an underdeveloped lung, to face this challenging environmental conditions, it's challenge this air that the quality is compromised, or even exposure to infectious diseases as well.
That's why I think children is such an important measurement for us, that this idea, speaking to respiratory consultants, of this glass ceiling, that we're creating these glass ceilings for children, both in vitro and in early childhood, that are limiting their future lung potential. And it's a bit like, we should see it a bit like watching a 3-year-old toddler walking around with a cigarette in their mouth. That we'd be appalled at that idea. But there are young children and babies in polluted areas that are effectively injuring their lung and damaging that lung's future potential from childbirth and before, and that should trouble us all. And you see that then manifest in chronic respiratory diseases later. Never mind the potential for asthma and the other things in early childhood. But this is a lung that's never reached its potential and is going to be much more vulnerable later on in life to other injuries. And hence is it any surprise in that sense that we see it's such a prevalent problem?
Absolutely. It's a child health issue that needs more visibility. I think that's one of the challenges that we have. We know about the air pollution and what it causes and the discomfort that it causes to the adults and the effects on productivity. But we also need to focus on what it's doing to the lungs of those children as they grow and develop and have face health issues later in life. And I think that's the part that we have to work to bring this to the attention of the public and the policymakers. Not so much bombard people with the statistics, but to show the face of this issue, the impact on those children, that just because they cannot move or because of the place where they live is in an area where the air quality is compromised, they're exposed, and they're exposed every single day of their lives.
I'll have you back to the podcast in just a moment. I just wanted to very briefly tell you about Farmwood. Farmwood is one of the most successful SME ventilation companies in the UK. Multi-award winning for their work in ventilation, compliance and health and safety. Farmwood has spent 23 years becoming the go-to service partner for a range of UK and EU ventilation manufacturers. They work on commercial, industrial and residential projects, and they're all about linking up academics, industry and engineers, driving real regulation reform, and most importantly, making sure the buildings we live and work in are healthier and safer for everyone. Their managing director, Nathan Wood, is a fellow campaigner of mine and someone I respect deeply. He is the chairman of World Ventilate Day and was previously the indoor air quality chairman at BESA. He's now leading the charge for competence and compliance across the ventilation sector in the UK. Farmwood are also really big advocates for apprenticeships, helping to develop the next generation of HVAC engineers who are going to keep our buildings breathing. They're a company that genuinely cares about buildings and people. You'll find more details in the show notes and at farmwood.co.uk. Now, back to the podcast. I think most listeners, and I think this would be a really good point to talk about it, I think most listeners have a mental picture of what childhood asthma can look like, right? I think we all have that emotive picture of a child struggling for breath, right? And we've had several high-profile cases of children dying before their time as a result of exposure to pollution of one sort or another, and the death manifesting in ultimately an asthma attack, their inability to breathe at all. So I think people viscerally, get that. But I don't think many people, when we talk about chronic respiratory diseases at the COPD end of this have a picture of what that looks like at its worst. It will kill you or can kill you, and it's a slow suffocation of a death. But I have my own personal picture of this. I think I spoke to you about this before, is why it resonates with me. But I think that two of us, it'd be good for us to talk about what COPD looks like for people. My mental picture of it is, as I used to, in my early career, was a paramedic. So a lot of our work would be going out to the emergency cases of COPD, but also a lot of community health visits of COPD, where you'd be bringing people in for respite care or for GPs visits and so on. And the reason the ambulances were involved is because people couldn't be transported by normal means when they were in a critical phase of COPD. And what that looks like is quite horrifying. You know, I've got very strong mental memories of very nice people trapped in their own home, literally with 3 oxygen cylinders, with nasal catheters for breathing. And the reason they had 3 in there, if they were lucky enough to have 3, but usually it was 3, was because they had one by their bed for when they were sleeping, one in the toilet for when they wanted to use the loo, and one in the chair that they sat at in their living room. And they would have to go from oxygen cylinder to oxygen cylinder to oxygen cylinder. And these people's lives might as well have been solitary confinement, you know, for want of a better word, a really tough existence. And even the process of standing up and taking a few steps, that person would all immediately be at their ceiling of their lungs potential to move enough air. And it's a horrible thing to see somebody struggling for breath. And you and I had this conversation of this kind of image of, try moving around your house and doing normal things if you peg your nose and you can only breathe through a straw. Like, knock your capability for breath down to being able to breathe through a straw, and feel how intoxicatingly claustrophobic that feels within seconds. How little you're just able to sit there and breathe through a straw. But the moment you try and do anything else, you're immediately at the ceiling. And it's a horrible place to be, because the more panicked you get, the more you're trying to breathe, the harder it becomes. That's my mental image of it. And it is a horrible image. Do you see that as a fair picture of what COPD can look like for a lot of people, Jose?
Yes, Simon, I think what you describe is the daily reality of hundreds of millions of people who suffer from COPD. It develops slowly and often silently, and it often goes undiagnosed for a number of years until, the time when it's diagnosed is probably very late. And even at that time, the patient doesn't fully understand, what the disease is and how to manage it. But it's a disease that progresses slowly, and as you described, eventually the person suffering from it becomes a prisoner to it. I think the example of the oxygen tank is one that can show, your listeners, for example, that oxygen tank lasts probably about 40 minutes. So any outdoor activity, for example, that person does, needs to be timed to the duration of that oxygen. So think about your movements being quite limited. And as the disease progresses, a person may initially may be able to walk to go and pick up the mail outside, and then they stop doing that, and then they stop going even to their living room. They remain in their bedroom because they cannot move. And then even this simple act of putting on a shirt is something that requires for them, an enormous amount of strain and effort because of the breathlessness. So slowly, this disease traps the person into immobility. And with that also drags members of the family who are caregivers and who are around that person. So it's a horrible disease. As we have said in this podcast, silent and invisible, because as that person cannot go outside to advocate and tell the world, that look at the disease that I have, then people don't understand the disease. And that's one of the challenges that we've had around the world, is that we haven't had very effective COPD advocates, because they are too sick to sustain a vigorous campaign to bring about this disease. And this is why we must raise the voice and give this disease a face in the public discussions.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to recognize that it's also a slow erosion of social contact and eventual isolation as well that comes with COPD, and it's a slow creep. Like you say, at the end, it's whether or not you go out to your letterbox, but perhaps long before there, it's not going to bingo anymore, or not going to your local club or community. Eventually you stop doing days out or traveling. That it's a slow creep, this. And I think one of the things actually that the COVID pandemic taught people was the power of isolation, the impact of not being able to interact with other humans. And so I think that resonates more than perhaps it would have done a decade ago. But I think it's a good mental image of what this means. COPD is this slow erosion of contact with people till eventually it's a core group of family members and caregivers with almost no contact outside of hospital visits and medical visits. That's the really sad thing, and it's the erosion of quality of life that comes with that.
And coupled with that is the stigma of the disease. Think about when you are in a social place and someone starts coughing, right? At the beginning, if it's 1 or 2 times that the person coughs, nobody notices. But if that cough repeats and that person continues to cough, you see people start to get very uneasy around and move and want to move away and become even irritated that someone is coughing. Even if in the case of someone with COPD, that cough is not an infectious cough, it does create a isolation on that person, because others don't want to be around someone who is coughing repeatedly. And I think that's also one of the elements I mentioned that starts to get the person from wanting to have that social interaction to going outside, because they know that when the moment they enter, they will be noticed because of their cough or their inability to walk without provoking these attacks of breathlessness or cough.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And whatever about the uncomfortableness of the people around somebody that's coughing, because it can sound quite productive, COPD coughs. It can sound quite, infectious. It isn't, but mentally for the individual with COPD, you can imagine, they don't want to go to the theatre anymore. They don't want to go to the cinema. They might not want to be in a public space because they don't want to be a nuisance. So, whatever about being a bit slow to get out of a particular building, or even needing an oxygen cylinder with them, people don't want to be a bother or a nuisance. And if they feel that coughing is, or that their respiratory illness is going to make them be seen in a bad light, they'll stop interacting in those spaces. And that's sad as well.
I wrote a story once about this boy who suffered from asthma, not COPD, but cough a lot. And in the school, they will call him the coughing boy. They will strip him of his name, of his personality, but because of the repeated cough, this is how he was recognized. And the teachers and the students, they knew when he was around because of his cough. So imagine someone in a society, and sometimes, how people are quick to judge, and people are also impatient sometimes with others around to have someone coughing around. I think even medical professionals will, react in ways that will make the person with, suffering from COPD feel that they're irritating them.
I mean, I suppose the clue's in the name. I mean, it's one of the, at least as a medical terminology, I think most people understand what it means. It's chronic, it's obstructive, it's a reduction of the ability to breathe. Pulmonary is lungs, and disease is disease. So I think people get that. What's the 101? Like, what is COPD? If you're trying to explain it to somebody, how does it differ from something like asthma? How do you describe what COPD is to somebody?
So chronic, I think the easiest way, and one of the challenges is also the name, because, in the public, and especially in different languages, it's very hard to present that picture. But I think that the best way to describe this is that it's a disease that will develop slowly, and slowly the person's ability to breathe will be diminished, as opposed to someone who has a cold or has an infectious disease, has a more acute type of breathlessness. So the best way, without going into scientific terms, because that's what I think then disconnects the public, is to show, a person that, every day takes fewer breaths, and every day has more difficulty in doing the daily activities without breathing, to the point where that immobilizes them, and they're unable to move from their bed, they're unable to go to the toilet, they're unable to talk to their visitors. So I think that visible image, and avoiding the clinical terms, is essential in this dialogue to bring about a connection between the public and those who are affected by the disease and are suffering, quietly the isolation effects of this disease.
And something you mentioned earlier, which I thought was very powerful, was this, I don't know if you termed it quite like that, but lack of sympathy effectively for COPD, that people's feeling towards asthma, because of the emotive nature of it, often involving children, feel that this is not on a lifestyle choice, that they have bad reactions to pollution, mold, something that's usually outside of their control, and it's an overreaction of the body's system to a trigger that causes a reaction in the lungs. COPD, the powerful trope that's developed is that this is a life choice of somebody who's made bad choices, and the ultimate image of this is a smoker in their 60s who got stained fingers from smoking 40 a day, and tough luck. You reap what you sow, and I'm being mean here, but that's kind of where the ultimate trope of this is, that somehow this is a life choice problem. If someone's wheezy, it's because they've somehow made poor choices. But this isn't just a smoker's illness, is it? This is an illness, particularly as we've seen in very high polluted areas, that's going to affect adults as they grow and their lungs are underdeveloped. But this is also an occupational disease, isn't it? I mean, this isn't something that people have intentionally gone out and put themselves in the position of.
Absolutely. I think you touch on a very important issue there, and that is the stigma that surrounds this disease, the perception that this disease is only a smoker's disease or something caused by age. Now we have the science to show that that is not the case, that also people who are breathing contaminated air, polluted air, develop this disease. And respiratory diseases, remain invisible until breathing becomes impossible. People, then have to seek medical attention. But people hide breathlessness. They avoid stares, they withdraw socially. Whether they were a smoker or not, it's just a reaction, and I think that's then coupled with the fact that that stigma that they will be grouped with the ex-smokers or those who brought about the disease in themselves. It even augments that fear, and that stigma then delays diagnosis. The chronic cough, sometimes is normalized. Okay, if you smoke, we expect you to cough and to be uncomfortable, and also even in some cultures like that, breathlessness is frequently accepted as part of the hard work. If somebody's working very hard, then they'll be short of breath. But those are all issues that affect on the psychology of people, especially who are suffering from this disease, in wanting to go public, or even wanting to seek medical care. So that's why it is so important to raise awareness about the causes of the disease, about the lives of these people. They're not just statistics. This is someone's father. This is someone's brother that is affected by this terrible disease. And what they need is not punishment, is not isolation, but they need help, and they need a way to help in managing this disease, through for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, and COPD is not something that can be reversed. Like when we say people need help, we know with asthma, there's an element of you can manage asthma, the flare-ups, the triggers, through medication and so on, health. But with COPD, I'm assuming you can relieve some of the symptoms of COPD, but ultimately a lung injury or a lung disease is a lung disease, and it's not reversible in that sense.
No, unfortunately, whereas in asthma we have tools and we're able to manage that effectively, COPD is not curable, and it is progressive, and it's going to become worse. It can be slowed if it is detected earlier, with proper management. There's pulmonary rehabilitation that has been used to help people who are affected. There's also medicines that are used also to help with the management. But it is, as the name says, it's a chronic and disease that is also progressive. The sad part is that many people are diagnosed when it's already at a late stage, when it is more difficult to manage and to treat, them more costly also to the health system.
So is that something then that the WHO is trying to do, is to get earlier intervention with these chronic diseases, that people recognize that it's not okay that I'm starting to not be able to do whatever about not being able to mountain bike anymore, or go walks up mountains and stuff like that you might associate with fitness or other issues. But if your daily routines are starting to be impacted by shortness of breath or an inability to breathe, that you start to act earlier and start to get some medical help.
Absolutely. And there are tools, to help in the diagnosis of that. For example, the measuring the lung function capacity, and tools such as, the spirometry that can be used to determine that, and to use that more widely around the world. That will enable the early diagnostic and then treatment and management of those people who are affected by by COPD. So it'll be important to make this type of testing, for example, in the annual mandatory health checks that some countries have, have a lung function test, or in the primary clinics when anyone who lives in a polluted city should have a lung function test just to determine, the capacity of the lung, or someone who has been who is living in a house where exposed to secondhand smoke should have that lung function test as well. So I think that training our medical providers, training the public, raising awareness of, so that they are educated about the risks of the disease and when to seek diagnosis, is very important. And it's something that we advocate at the WHO. But then, diagnostic is one part. If a person then is diagnosed, it has to be a system that is able then to manage them properly. So that system in most countries is the primary healthcare system. So the investment and the training of the medical personnel in that primary healthcare system to address the COPD or the asthma is essential. So both have to be done. We cannot do one or the other.
Is there a reluctance or a nervousness, do you think, in certain parts of the world that this is too known about? Because I imagine at the scale that it is, the fear is resourcing what the true numbers are, finding the silence, as we often say in air quality. Like you say, people hide this, and if you are starting to detect it early in a highly polluted area, and you don't really have the agency to do anything about it, that could be seen as a risk, I imagine, politically or from a policy perspective, that you're uncovering something in some way that's more of a problem than people realized. There must be some resistance to that, because there must be an iceberg element to this at the scale that it's at, that if you were to genuinely be picking this up early and have the true numbers and be able to track it, I imagine it'd be fairly frightening.
Absolutely. I think you touched there on, one of the delicate issues, and that is the capacity of the system to treat them and to provide medications, which is medications for life, for those people. That is a significant cost, to the system. Also a significant cost in human resources, the training and also having personnel to manage these patients. But I think what countries need to look at is what is the other side, is that not addressing them is going to have a larger, more costly impact on their economy. Because those people, if you are able to diagnose early and treat them earlier, the cost of that treatment is going to be less than discovering a patient at a later stage that requires a more intensive and costlier type of treatment to manage, deteriorating health condition. Not to mention also the absenteeism or the interruption of work that person has had, and the impact of that on the economy.
Yeah. And there's also a certain amount of stick to wield at the occupational end of this as well. I imagine that there's a lot of occupational risk in certain environments. I mean, we've seen it over the years with asbestosis, silicosis, environmental triggers that would cause injury, lung injury. Most recently we've seen the cases with the worktops, with workers working with these kind of fake granite worktops, causing unbelievably fast downhill trajectories from a lung injury perspective. Really quite shocking. But also, you've got construction workers and welders and people in industrial environments and people that are exposed to stuff that's going to cause COPD later on in life, where this is an occupational health and safety issue. Does the WHO kind of get involved in that side of it as well, that they're providing tools or talking to industry about the impacts of practices in the workplace?
That's interesting that you mentioned this. Just last week, we had a meeting with the International Labour Organization, to begin exploring this issue. For example, you mentioned all of the different professions, including firefighters and others, who are exposed constantly to air that damages their lungs. And it is a very large issue that will require the involvement of different sectors to address it. But it's one that I think that will be important to address, because every day hundreds of millions of people are exposed to conditions that will lead them to develop COPD, and those need to be addressed. A starting point, it's, as I mentioned, is in countries that require the mandatory health checks for work to get some data on those issues, and then also working with the organizations that set the labor standards in countries to ensure that also those are enforced, that they are monitored, and where there are issues are addressed. But my understanding, and I'm not an expert in labor, as I said, we begin these discussions. This is quite a large and complex issue, because the number of stakeholders that need to participate. But I'm encouraged that we're beginning these conversations with other UN agencies, and as well as groups, the technical groups in the WHO that are responsible for this area of work.
Yeah, I think the thing that you're right. I mean, it's hugely complex. It's a massive ecosystem, the workplace, and very complex to go into. I've got somebody actually coming on the podcast next week who's, or actually on tomorrow, sorry, who's an occupational safety person involved in construction, talking about construction risk, of workers being around high levels of dust for large periods of time and the injuries that that's causing. But I think the one advantage that sector have is that there's also very well established legal instruments that are supposed to protect workers. And often that's a huge advantage, because you have those levers that in many other spaces you might not have, and a responsibility of employers to protect the workforce. So I think that's what encourages me about that sector. Whether that there are certain parts of the world that'll be very difficult to achieve meaningfully, but in many parts of the world, that's just a much more robust approach to some of those risks by the people that supervise those legal instruments can make a huge difference. And again, we've seen that with the exposure to worktops. Australia really hit hard on that very quickly. We've seen globally that reach recognition that we've moved very, very quickly on occupational exposure to worktop dust. So that's encouraging in that sense.
You're right. I think in that area, there are policies already in effect. It's a question of the monitoring and enforcement of those standards.
Yeah, like a lot of this stuff, it's often a policing issue. That we know what to do. There are rules about what you're supposed to do. The challenge is enforcement. And there can be many, many reasons why that enforcement isn't there. But, in a lot of circumstances, people exposures to environmental risks, there are very well rounded and understood mechanisms for protecting people. It's a case of whether or not it's a high enough priority for people to do something about it.
Exactly, and especially with air quality, we know what works. We've seen what other cities have done to improve the quality of the air. And in fact, some countries have the policies in effect. The challenge is mustering the political will, to make that happen, to enforce those policies, and to ensure that there is accountability, to understand that if something needs to be fixed, and who will be responsible, and ensuring that those who are responsible get the job done.
It's an enormous amount. I mean, it's a huge undertaking. I mean, it must fill you equally with optimism of what you can do and fear of the size of the task in hand. It's a huge undertaking. What are your hopes for the next kind of couple of years in this field? Where's your kind of attention directed at? What are the successes or things you're trying to get done?
Sure, I'm very optimistic, Simon. I think that, especially on this work on chronic respiratory diseases, in 2025, we created a political alignment. We saw for the first time chronic respiratory diseases recognized at the UN level in the political declaration, along with for other diseases like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and cancer for the first time. We also earlier in that year had the World Health Assembly's integrated lung health resolution, which brings the countries, to address the issue of lung health in a coordinated manner. There is a momentum in place around the world now around chronic respiratory diseases that is encouraging. So in 2026, we must deliver on implementation. I think we need to turn these global commitments into reality, mobilizing, health systems, cities, clinicians, and communities, around one charge goal, and that is to protect the breath. I think that's something that we can all relate to. So, I think that we finally, in 2025, lung health finally entered the global political agenda. We can say that in a way that had not happened before. The question now is whether that recognition will change how people breathe in their daily lives.
Yeah, that's true. And there's a real theme, I think, of last year, and I'm seeing it moving into this year, is this multidisciplinary element to air quality, that a recognition that we've got to break out of our silos somewhat, and that air quality, particularly indoor air quality, and that listeners to this show don't need reminding, but perhaps outside do, that the majority of our exposure to outdoor air will occur indoors, and the indoors in any environment, home or work, has a huge impact in your long-term health, COPD being one of the primary ones. And we've seen the built environment as an engineering problem to solve. The air chemists and the engineers and the regulators, it's been very building focus, because those were the mechanisms that impacted buildings. But more and more now, there's this call for the medical community to step up and step into that conversation, that, and that manifests with every GP asking the question, why are the symptoms that are in front of me? Why is the environment not a good story for that person's exposed to? And starting to empower the medical community to start asking the right questions about people's exposure to their environment, because it's so impactful on their health, and it doesn't happen enough, I don't think. So I think that when we talk about implementation, I think the thing that encourages me is that starts to happen when these silos start talking, and we start to realize that the medical community can have an impact on the built environment community and vice versa, and that ultimately we don't fix this without those silos working better together. I think you've seen that reflected on that as well, haven't you?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that breathing connects the environment, connects equity and health. And I think if we are to ensure that people are able to breathe well, we have to be able to influence the type of places where they live, where they work, where they spend most of their indoor time. It's true that we spend most of our time indoors and breathing, so the quality of the air that we breathe inside is essential. I mean, I think we said that at the United Nations. We cannot address only one part of the the air pollution, but the indoor quality and the structures in which we are, the structures that we're developing, in cities and around the world have to be designed in such a way that protect the health of the people that will be in those places. It's not just the architectural design or the the materials there, but also what that does for the health of the people.
Yeah, it's my it's my tagline for 2026 is that we're not in the built environment. The built environment is in us. Or we're not in build. Yeah, that this is the kind of mental leap that we need to make, that we don't exist in buildings. Buildings exist in us, and we have, so it's important that they're doing what they need to do to protect us. And we were saying at the very beginning of the show, the fundamental contract we have with buildings is under Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that the building was there to shelter us and protect us and provide us with a foundation to do what we need to do in those buildings, whether it's work or live or eat or sleep or flourish and survive and have a family. They have a purpose. Buildings aren't just boxes without purpose. And somehow that contract is broken, that buildings have become a place, whether because of allowing the ingress of outdoor risk or whether creating the risk in itself, are injuring us. And that's not the deal we made with shelter. that we need to reconfigure that deal or re-establish that fundamental deal and recognize that those buildings have a purpose that they're not fulfilling.
Absolutely. I mean, those buildings, those structures are there to serve people. They are an instrument for people to do the types of works that they do, not the other way around. So I think that it is important that as they are designed and they are built, that they take into account, the standards that will ensure and ensure that the health of the people who will be inhabiting those places is protected, and also ensures that there are no injuries and that they are able to to do their works effectively in the long term. And I think I mentioned the long term there because it's important. Sometimes now there is a tendency to do things in the short term. We may develop a system that filters the air and is good for 1 or 2 years. I think that we need to think about durable solutions as we develop the environment, the buildings and the environment.
Yeah, and that often some of these solutions aren't engineering solutions; they're habitual and community-based solutions. They're policy mechanisms. There's 100 different ways to impact the built environment. I mean, one of the fascinating conversations I had with Priyanka Kolshreta from Delhi was around reducing exposure of cooking over solid fuel in the lower economic strata of India. And one of the policy mechanisms they introduced there was subsidies on clean fuel. So they couldn't change the built environment. People still had to cook over burners effectively in a lot of buildings that were going to be poorly ventilated. And culturally, they'd have used, fuel sources that were very polluting. But a simple mechanism of making it affordable to buy gas effectively makes a huge difference. It's not an engineering solution as such. It was a policy mechanism that made it effectively cheaper to have a gas bottle, and that made a massive difference to people's lives. Things around where schools are located next to roads and planting greenery, all of the, as barriers, like all of these things can make huge differences and don't necessarily require action of an individual or the installation of an air filter. We can't solve all of the problems at once, but there is some very positive things that can be done at all levels to kind of reduce the burden here, isn't there?
Absolutely. I mean, I think over the years we have learned, about how to develop, buildings that protect the health, that also create outdoor spaces for people and greener spaces, transport systems that are, well ventilated, and also we have created systems that give people the confidence that they are, in a place that is healthy. And that place especially is going to be the workplace, because it's where people spend, half of their day, or the majority of their day. So we were talking about earlier about, the occupational health. I mean, that is a high priority.
Fascinated to ask you how you've ended up here. How have you found yourself as the Director General looking at COPD in the WHO? What's your background, Jose? Have you come from the medical side of things, or has it been from somewhere else?
No, I'm not. I'm not a physician by training, but I have worked in public health through most of my professional career, the past 3 decades. I have worked in issues related to lung health. I started my career in the 1990s working in tuberculosis control, and during the next 20 years was a major part of the focus of my work, tuberculosis and lung disease. Then, as you know, I went on to found viral strategies, which worked in chronic to address the issues of prevention of chronic diseases. And so that's a combination between the lung and chronic diseases. But my work has really been always in strengthening systems and in finding ways on how to give visibility to those issues that are invisible. I think tuberculosis is an excellent example of disease that is an ancient disease that affects disproportionately poor people, and it's still a public health issue of our time, affecting millions of people, and still the leading infectious disease killers. So when we talk about equity, I mean, this is one of those diseases that first come to mind. So that work, in tuberculosis and then in non-communicable diseases combined, bring me to work on chronic respiratory diseases.
Yeah, it sounds to me like you've always been in touch with or very close to the coalface of this equity challenge in your work. What are the things we're not talking about when it comes to how unfair these diseases and air quality and things like infectious diseases like TB are affecting people? Because it's environmental justice is something that I've only really started to look at in the last 12 months, seriously. It's such a big piece of all of these conversations, isn't it? That who is impacted by these things. And it sounds to me like you've been within touching distance of that throughout your career. Are there things we need to do more broadly in the industry to be more aware of this, about how this impacts people?
One thing that I have learned, Simon, about this disease and equity, and I think in drawing some lessons from the HIV/AIDS community, in how they address this issue, is I think that we cannot just focus on these diseases and say they only affect the poor people or those in marginalized areas, because then we lose that access to the public imagination. I think this is the disease that affects us all. Anybody who breathes, and that's whether it is rich or poor, large or small, or Asian or Hispanic, is at risk of these diseases. And I think we need to bring the discussion in such a way that people feel that they have also a stake in these issues that we're talking about and in resolving these issues, because sooner or later they may be impacted. But I think that if we try to put it into segments, then there is a tendency, okay, well, that isn't going to affect me. I saw that in tuberculosis, where initially the discussions and the imagery were of people in developing countries in some place in India. So if you were in New York, if you were in Philadelphia or in London, you say, well, that's really far from me. But the reality was different. TB is in London. TB was in New York. It was killing, people, not first by the hundreds and by the thousands. And it was invisible. So by giving visibility, I think we have to broaden the dialogue and say, it affects us all. It will affect you too, even if, you're and you are in a comfortable place with all the air filters in the world, because eventually you will come out into the street, or you will have to go to a place that doesn't have all those features. Mm.
Yeah, and this is a compound illness as well. This isn't just for smokers. It's not binary. That is what I'm trying to say. That there's an impact over your lifetime of being in different environments and being exposed to different risks. So sitting here now, you might not see where you are today as a particular risk, but that injury might have already occurred. There might be things you're doing in the next 20 years that will add to an injury, and it's an accumulative thing. This, you'll find you may not be as severely affected as some of the pictures we were drawing earlier, but nonetheless, this could seriously impact your life later on. And it was an interesting conversation with Plum Stone from Safer Air Project. She makes the very powerful point around the vulnerable populations that she represents from an infection risk perspective, that we're only one GP's visit away from being a vulnerable person of some description or another. Like, we know the rates of cancer, we know the rates of other illnesses, cardiovascular illnesses, mental health, all of these things. We're only one diagnosis away from being one of those people. It's a great leveler, air quality in that respect, is that everybody breathes. This is something that everybody undertakes, and therefore it affects us all. You may not see it yet, but I think if people stop, if they understand the landscape well enough and stop and think about actually the people around me in my life, how many people could you actually class as vulnerable, maybe being a bit breathless, having cardiovascular issues, knowing somebody that's had cancer, like all of a sudden you realize, hang on, this stuff adds up. And, we're talking specifically about lung disease here, but there are many other diseases as a result of air quality that are on top of that. So it's an enormous issue.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the risks are enormous and not visible immediately. You may be already, exposed, or, has triggered already the disease, and, the symptoms may not be there. And I think that's why people need to take it seriously, and they need to take it with a sense of urgency. I think that's the part that we need to emphasize.
Jose, it's been brilliant talking to you today. It's been a fabulous conversation and really enlightening, I think, from the perspective of understanding a little bit more about COPD. I don't think many of us stop enough to think about this disease. The numbers are staggering. Like, this is something that has to be taken very, very seriously indeed. And I think this is a habit and an environmental disease that means all of us in the air quality, built environment, engineering, scientific community have to really, I think, refocus on the impact of this of chronic respiratory diseases in general, because it's an area that I don't think gets nearly enough attention. So thanks so much. I really appreciate you coming on to talk to me today. It's been absolutely brilliant.
Thank you, Simon, for having me here. I think that, as I said earlier, breathing is universal. And when we protect the quality and deliver the care, we protect the lives and the economies at the same time. So I think breathing is the starting point, but it has so many other ramifications that we should keep in mind, and we should always think about how we protect it.
Well, I'll share some links in the show notes. I'll get you to send me some things that you can point people to that will be useful information if they want to know more. I think it's a fabulous role and a really important project you're undertaking. So I wish you all the best in it, and we'll no doubt cross paths, I'm sure, very soon. So Jose, thanks a million. Really good to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you for having me here.
Thanks for listening. Before you go, can I ask a favour? Before you shoot off to whatever it is you have to do next, or even the next podcast, if you enjoyed what we've been talking about here, please do spread the word and let's keep building this community. And don't forget to check out our sponsors in the show notes: Ultra Protect, Eurovent, Erico, ACO, Farmwood and Zender, all amazing companies, and without them this podcast would just simply not be possible. Check them out in the show notes at airqualitymatters.net, and do check out our YouTube channel. All this content is there, plus much more. See you again next week.